Hi, I'm Glyn Blackett and I help my clients work with problems to do with brain performance, such as difficult emotions like anxiety, anger, irritability or low mood, brain fog or poor focus and fuzzy thinking, and fatigue or low motivation and lack of willpower. That is, problems not necessarily serious enough to be diagnosed as medical conditions. And let me make it clear, I'm a health coach, not a medical practitioner. I can't diagnose or treat medical conditions, so my service is not a substitute for seeing your doctor. But maybe you're in this big gap between optimal health on the one hand and actual illness on the other. Let's face it, the NHS is focused on people here and doesn't always meet your needs if you're here. Maybe you've been to the doctor and the doctor's either found nothing wrong or offered you medications when you'd rather find better solutions that actually address causes. This is where I can help. In this video, I'm going to talk about 7 keys to upgrading your brain or getting the best out of your brain, or putting in place the physiological conditions for emotional well-being, optimal cognitive performance, and abundant energy and willpower. The 7 keys are areas where you can make practical changes that count, that get results in terms of strengthening your emotional positivity, your focus, your clarity of thinking. Now, just as there's no one single cause for any of the problems that I'm talking about, there isn't one solution that will work for everyone. What we need is a personalized approach that identifies the weak points in your physiological functioning. These are the places where you can make the most difference. Then it's a matter of making targeted diet and lifestyle change, perhaps also with nutritional supplementation to address those weaknesses. I'll say more about how I can help with the process at the end of the video. But first let me say what the 7 keys are. They are: 1. Stabilize your blood sugar. 2. Regulate your stress response and your adrenal glands, which are intimately connected to stress regulation. 3. Control inflammation. 4. Clean up your gut function. 5. Support detoxification. 6. Optimize methylation. 7. Optimize breathing chemistry. Now, the order I've listed them in is not particularly significant. I'm not saying that the first one should be the top priority or anything like that. But to some extent, they'll be easier to explain in this order. So let's go through the 7 in more depth. The first key is to stabilize your blood sugar. You probably know that blood sugar instability is what lies behind diabetes and pre-diabetes, and the damaging health effects these conditions cause. You may also know that blood sugar problems are linked to Alzheimer's disease, which some researchers have dubbed diabetes type 3. But you don't have to have diabetes or even pre-diabetes for blood sugar control to affect your focus, mood, sleep, energy, willpower, and your ability to handle stress. There's a more immediate connection. Before I explain what it is, I want to make one more point, which is that a lot of people end up with diabetes or pre-diabetes when they shouldn't. They're not overweight, they eat pretty well, and they're not at high risk, yet they still develop a condition called insulin resistance, which lies behind diabetes and pre-diabetes. The point is, insulin resistance has other causes besides poor diet, and the 2 big ones are stress and inflammation, which we'll come to later. First, let's return to the more immediate problem with blood sugar. For most people, brain cells' primary and preferential fuel is glucose, which we get from sugar and carbs in our diet. For optimal performance, the brain likes a smooth, stable supply of fuel. So the brain monitors blood glucose levels, and it does its best to regulate them. It wants to avoid the energy crashes that come when blood glucose drops low. The brain can detect falling blood sugar, and it can anticipate a coming energy crash or a fuel scarcity. And to guard against that, it can conserve its resources. It can deactivate some of its own energy-hungry processing, which typically means the prefrontal part of the brain, which plays a key role in executive functioning. The bottom line is falling blood sugar can trigger a loss of focus and concentration, emotional regulation, motivation, and willpower. This is a research finding. You can read more about it in this outstanding book by health psychologist Dr. Kelly McGonigal, in which she highlights the importance of stable blood sugar for willpower or self-control. Let me be clear here, blood sugar doesn't even have to drop particularly low for this to happen, it just has to be falling. If you eat a sugary food or fast-releasing carbs, then you'll get a blood sugar spike, inevitably followed an hour or two later by a drop in blood sugar, and that's when you're in danger of this kind of energy crash and loss of performance. So part of the solution is to, as far as possible, avoid foods that trigger this kind of response. Now, this kind of reaction may be a learned response. Not everybody's brain does this to the same degree. The more unstable your blood sugar is, or has been in the past, the more likely the brain is to make these predictions. All the more so if you struggle to raise your blood sugar. Which brings us to the second key. Regulate your stress response and your adrenal glands. Now, ordinarily, if your blood sugar drops low because you haven't eaten for a while, the body mobilizes reserves to boost it back up again, and it does that using hormones. Probably the most important blood sugar boosting, energy mobilizing hormone is cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, which is to say its release is triggered by stress, both physical and mental, and also it helps you to deal with stress by mobilizing energy. But that doesn't mean to say that you only have cortisol when the pressure's on. In fact, it's naturally ever present and regulates your energy over the course of the day, starting high in the morning when you need to go into action and dropping low in the evening when you're ready for sleep. At least that's how it should be. The problem is, cortisol and other adrenal hormones can easily become dysregulated. This tends to happen as a result of lots of stress. Particularly problematic is unremitting stress, even if it's quite minor, like always having a deadline to meet. And not just mental stress, but physical stress, which you might not even recognize as stress, such as heavy fitness training or having a health problem such as a hidden gut problem, which I'll say more about later on. If cortisol becomes chronically high, you tend to feel wired, on edge all the time, unable to switch off, maybe struggling to get to sleep at night, and yet feeling tired at the same time. If cortisol is on the low side or unavailable, the predominant experience is one of fatigue, low energy and low motivation, and loss of stress tolerance, meaning little things upset you inordinately. Another pattern of adrenal dysregulation is that you can lose the daily rhythm of your cortisol. Again, it should be high in the morning and low at night. Brain imaging studies show this pattern correlates with poor brain regulation of emotion and stress. Basically, the executive brain circuits that normally keep in check the emotion-triggering centers, such as the amygdala, are underactive. Again, we're not necessarily talking about medical issues here. In most cases, it's not that the adrenal glands have something wrong with them, they're just not getting the right messages, ultimately from the brain. So what can you do to re-regulate the adrenals? Well, there's lots of supplements available for adrenal support, such as adaptogenic herbs, which have good research support. These can be useful in the short term, but they don't necessarily address the underlying causes of adrenal dysregulation. What's needed in the long term is again diet and lifestyle change. Diet is important again to stabilize blood sugar and prevent the crashes that will strain the adrenals. But probably most important of all is to learn to handle stress more effectively. This is probably my favorite area for helping my clients. I have some great tools available for stress management, especially biofeedback and breathing training, which I'll say more about later. But stress is not the only factor that can cause adrenal dysregulation. Another is inflammation. So the third key is to control inflammation. Everyone has experience of inflammation. If you cut yourself, the area of skin becomes hot and red and swollen and painful. That's inflammation, localized to the skin. It doesn't feel good, but it's important to the repair process. Inflammation is a response generated by your immune system to protect you from threats like infections and to repair damage. But inflammation can be a problem when it's generalized, that is, happening throughout the body, and when it doesn't turn off. This is known as systemic inflammation, and it's linked to virtually every chronic health problem you can think of, including depression and Alzheimer's. Ordinarily, the immune system doesn't extend inside the brain. The brain is kept isolated behind what's called the blood-brain barrier. Within, the brain has its own immune system in the form of non-neuronal cells called microglia. But what can happen is that inflammatory signals originating elsewhere in the body can communicate to the brain, and the brain can generate its own inflammatory response. When this happens, you don't feel it as pain, but as a loss of brain function. So brain fog, mood problems, fatigue, loss of motivation. More and more leading doctors and researchers are seeing brain inflammation as the major causal mechanism for depression and other brain problems. For example, psychiatrist Dr. Kelly Brogan makes the case very well in her book A Mind of Your Own. Dr. Brogan tells us that inflammatory signals in the form of molecules called cytokines not only correlate with depression, but they actually predict it ahead of time. Brain inflammation, like the disorders associated with it, can persist for years or even decades. That's because once activated, microglia are quite hard to switch off. Don't worry, it is possible, but one of the things that you have to do is address the origin of the inflammatory signals being communicated to the brain. And more often than not, this is the gut, which brings me to the next key. Key 4 is to clean up your gut functioning. The gut has a profoundly important job to do. If it doesn't do it well, then no other body system, including the brain, can work optimally. It needs to provide you with the nutrients that you need. And secondly, it needs to protect you from everything else that might get into your gut that is not a nutrient. This includes toxic substances, such as mercury that's found in some fish, and even partially digested food, which if it got into your bloodstream, would be potentially harmful. It also includes microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi that are naturally found living in the gut, as well as in foods. You'll know that your immune system defends against infections, and in fact, your immune system is concentrated in your gut because that's where it needs to be. So it's not surprising that weaknesses in gut function can trigger the immune system to generate an inflammatory response that can be communicated to the brain, causing the kind of problems that I've been talking about. Now, at this point, you might be thinking that it isn't really relevant to you because you don't have any gut health problems. But here's the key thing you need to hear. A lot of gut health problems are silent or hidden, in the sense that you don't feel them in the gut. You don't have any overt gastrointestinal symptoms like indigestion or heartburn or belly aches or diarrhea or anything like that. But if you do have brain problems like fatigue or brain fog or low mood, then it's certainly worth considering gut health as a hidden source. There are two main keys to healthy gut function: the microbiome and then gut permeability. The microbiome is the population of microorganisms living in your gut. If it's unhealthy or imbalanced, that is lacking the kind of bugs that benefit you while more harmful species are over-predominant, then it basically provokes the immune system to react, perhaps with chronic low-level inflammation. Secondly, if your gut has increased permeability, also known as leaky gut syndrome, then it leads to toxic material getting into the body. And this can also provoke the immune system and has to be dealt with by the detoxification system. I'll say more about that in a minute. Now, it's fair to say that these two factors are more like immediate mechanisms than primary causes. And if they're out of whack, you need to go further and ask why. And there are many possible causal links, too many to list in the time I have available here. So I'm just going to mention one contributing factor, which is vitamin D deficiency. Vitamin D plays an important role in gut health, and moreover, it's strongly anti-inflammatory. Boosting vitamin D levels up into the optimal range could well prove helpful for gut health, as well as for brain function more generally. Testing your vitamin D is cheap and easy, and it's something that I recommend for all my clients. So the fifth key to upgrading your brain performance is to support detoxification. These days there's quite a lot of controversy surrounding detoxification. On the one hand, you've got some of the perhaps less scientifically rigorous practitioners of alternative or complementary health promoting the idea that your body is full of toxins that need to be somehow purged. On the other hand, we have commentators claiming to be more scientific, suggesting that such claims amount to quackery and that your body will just quite naturally deal with anything toxic without you needing to even think about it, almost no matter what you throw at it. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. Your body does have detoxification systems, most notably in the liver, but actually in all your cells, but they do have a finite capacity. For example, if you down a couple of bottles of wine, it takes at least several hours for your liver to process the alcohol fully, and even then you might feel a bit grungy for a few days. When there's a high toxic burden on the liver, the result is rather like what happens in road systems when the traffic volume exceeds the capacity of the roads. If you close 2 lanes out of 3 on the motorway, then the traffic slows down to a crawl and it gets backed up perhaps for miles. It's the same with toxicants in the body. Until the detox systems have had a chance to process them, they're floating around in your system and free to cause ill effects. If the system is consistently overburdened, then it can eventually take its toll. For example, if you persist in drinking too much alcohol regularly over decades, you can end up with liver disease. Some more scientifically established facts about detoxification. First, the detox systems require raw materials in the form of nutrients in order to carry out the biochemical transformations needed. If for any reason the supply is deficient, then your detoxification capacity is compromised at least to some extent. Second, some substances, mercury for example, are just plain toxic at any level, and any safe limit is ultimately arbitrary. Third, some toxic substances are harmful even in tiny amounts because they work as hormone disruptors. That is, they send signals to your body or they block signals. Fourth, toxicants can be stored in the body, especially those hard to process, and including hormone disruptors, notably in fat tissue, also in brain tissue, which is actually made up largely of fat. So clearly, if you want your brain to function optimally, it makes sense to make sure that your detoxification system is working well, and to limit the burden you place on it by avoiding exposure to toxicants as far as possible. Perhaps the single most important factor is to keep your gut healthy and relatively impermeable. A healthy gut will block absorption of toxicants in the first place. And make sure your diet is providing all the nutrients that the detox systems need. A lot of nutrients, for example antioxidants such as vitamin C, offer their benefit in part at least because they assist in the detoxification process. So in other words, again, it comes down largely to diet and lifestyle factors. There's no getting away from it. So what about all the other detoxing methods that you hear about? I think for the most part, it isn't necessary to actively try to pull toxicants out of the body. If they are stored in fat tissue, it's probably for a good reason. And it's probably risky, or it could be risky, to disturb them. Now that's assuming that your detox methods actually work, which is certainly not always proven. Probably it's fair to say that if you look after the other 6 keys, then this one will look after itself. The 6th key is to optimize methylation. Methylation is a ubiquitous biochemical process happening in all our cells. I'm not going to go into the details because it's rather technical and you don't need an in-depth understanding to have it working well. But it is worth saying something about why it matters to brain function. And the short answer is that it's to do with neurotransmitters. Now, there's a popular notion that mood and brain function is largely down to a set of brain chemicals called neurotransmitters. For example, too little serotonin and you get depressed. The reality is that neurotransmitter balance is only one factor out of many that can influence your mood. And even then, it's probably not that significant as a causal factor for brain problems, except perhaps as a mechanism. Probably it's true that disrupting serotonin function leads to mood problems. But you've got to ask what caused the disruption in the first place. I've already mentioned brain inflammation as a major part of the story, but another part is methylation. Serotonin function is not simply down to how much serotonin you've got. The effects of any neurotransmitter are strongly dependent on how quickly the brain mops it up after it's been released. Antidepressants like Prozac affect this process of reuptake, but so does methylation. One of the key reasons methylation matters so much to brain function is that it affects neurotransmitter reuptake. This idea is explained in much more depth by Dr. William Walsh in his book Nutrient Power. His work is based on running functional lab tests on mental health patients, and at the time of publication he'd evaluated over 30,000 people. How well your body does methylation depends on diet and lifestyle factors, but it also depends, to some extent, on your genes. There are known gene mutations that compromise your ability to methylate. And according to Dr. Walsh, specific problems with methylation can lead to either overactivity or underactivity of neurotransmitters due to differences in reuptake. But methylation is not cast in stone. Even if you have genetic defects, you can compensate for the weaknesses, for example, supplying more of the nutrient cofactors such as the B vitamins. And here's the key thing. Which ones you use depends on whether you want to enhance or suppress neurotransmitter activity. And the best way to know that is to assess your methylation with functional lab testing. Because if you make the wrong choice, you can make things worse. That's the value of functional lab testing. So far, all the keys will be familiar to you if you've done a lot of reading about the emerging functional medicine model of healthcare. But my final key is often overlooked, and yet it's highly significant to optimal brain performance, maybe even more significant than all the others, at least in some cases. Clearly, breathing is fundamentally about getting oxygen into the body, not just into the lungs, but delivering it right into the cells where it's needed. Breathing chemistry is about the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and our cells. Why is breathing so important to brain performance? Well, clearly for optimal functioning, the brain needs a steady supply of oxygen. You could be forgiven if you take your breathing for granted, but here's the thing, dysregulation of breathing chemistry is common, much more common than you might think, and it results in reduced oxygen delivery to brain cells to a significant degree, and yet it's often unrecognized. The most common form of dysregulation is somewhat paradoxically overbreathing. Paradoxical because overbreathing or hyperventilation results in reduced oxygen delivery to brain cells. The main trigger for overbreathing is stress or anxiety. In severe cases, for example a classic panic attack, the brain's oxygen supply can be reduced by as much as 60%. Now, if you're like a lot of my clients, you might be thinking at this point, you don't hyperventilate, so this isn't really relevant to you. My answer is, if you have brain problems like fatigue or anxiety, don't be so sure. The thing is, overbreathing is a matter of degree. Okay, you know about it if your brain has 60% less oxygen, but in mild cases, the deficit is 10, maybe 20%. And it's these cases that are common and unrecognized. In fact, I'd say the large majority of my stress and anxiety clients have non-optimal breathing patterns, at least to some degree. That's based on my experience of measuring clients' breathing using a device called a capnometer, which actually detects carbon dioxide in exhaled air. This is the best indicator for overbreathing. Not only can you assess breathing in this way, you can use the capnometer to train optimal breathing. And this is a form of biofeedback. It's one of my favourite tools for teaching people to regulate stress and anxiety, and often gets very good results. So these are the 7 keys to upgrading your brain and for achieving emotional well-being, optimal cognitive function, and abundant energy and willpower. Before I conclude, let me just list them once again. 1. Stabilise your blood sugar. 2. Regulate your stress response and your adrenal glands. 3. Control inflammation. 4. Clean up your gut functioning. 5. Support detoxification. 6. Optimize methylation. And 7. optimize breathing chemistry. Now you might have a sense that these 7 are all interconnected, and you'd be absolutely right. That's the real nature of the human body and mind as a set of interrelated systems. And it emphasizes the need for a systems-based approach that addresses causes rather than suppresses symptoms. A lot of everyday problems are of the nature of imbalances in functioning rather than outright diseases. I've explained the 7 keys as areas for making changes, but I haven't said much about practical steps for making improvements. Well, there's a lot that could be said, probably several books worth, but that's not really the point of this video. Rather, it's to give you just an initial idea of what's needed and why it's needed, and further, how I can help you in the process, so that you can decide whether or not you'd like to work with me or another health practitioner. So let me just summarize the approach. It starts with functional lab testing and other assessments relating to brain performance, such as the breathing assessment that I've just mentioned. We can then identify the weak points in body systems functioning for you personally, so that you can focus your efforts in places where you'll make the most difference. If you like, it's identifying the key keys out of the 7 that I've listed, but also in a few more areas that I haven't talked about. Then it's a matter of making personalised or targeted nutrition, diet and lifestyle changes to support these weak points and improve functioning. Let me say something more about my role in the process. I can help you with accessing lab tests. I offer packages of lab tests selected to be the most relevant to brain problems like fatigue, anxiety and brain fog. And I can help you to customize the selections based on your patterns of symptoms and also what you're trying to achieve. And I can help you interpret the results and turn the results into strategies for change that are most likely to be effective. Suppose you want to lose some excess weight and your test results suggest signs of insulin resistance causing blood sugar problems. In that case, research suggests that you'll do well with intermittent fasting, for example, and also with high-intensity interval training, both of which can improve insulin sensitivity, but not if your testing also shows adrenal dysregulation. These methods can stress you to the point that you feel worse, not better. Another example, to control inflammation, it can really help to have optimal vitamin D blood levels. A lot of people need to supplement to reach the optimal level, but how much do you need? The best way to tell is by first measuring your actual blood level. Further, I can help with actually implementing change. That means behavioural change in the context of your life. Often what's difficult for people is not knowing what to do, but actually doing it. For example, difficult feelings such as anxiety or cravings can stand in the way. I can coach you on how to work with these feelings using cutting-edge tools like biofeedback. If you want to take things further, what are the next steps that you could take? Well, my business is based on offering packages of carefully selected functional lab tests based on samples that you can easily collect at home, combined with coaching time. I appreciate that a decision to make such an investment in your health is not to be made lightly, and it's not going to be right for everybody. To help you get to a point where you can make that decision, I have 2 things to tell you about. The first is that if you signed up for this video on my website, then I'll be emailing you a sequence of articles going further into some of the sort of material that I've been discussing here. Don't worry, each one is short and tries to stick to one concept at a time, and you can unsubscribe at any point. Secondly, I've put together a video course which covers the concepts that you'll need to understand in much more depth. It's designed to help clients understand important concepts such as insulin resistance and adrenal function, providing an important foundation for actually making changes in your life. The course is in 8 parts and the videos are generally about 20 to 30 minutes long. You can sign up for the course on my website. Lastly, if you have any questions about this video or about anything else in my website, please feel free to contact me. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to keeping in touch.